Hello, David, my friend. How are you today?
All right, Leighton, how are you doing?
No complaints. It's a beautiful sunny day here in Southern California, so life is good.
Right.
Thank you for joining us today. I really appreciate this. You've been one of my um, most interesting friends out here, and I've been wanting to get you on the podcast and just keep forgetting to, link you in. But I really appreciate you coming on today. And so, as I typically do to new guests to the platform, I ask you to go ahead and introduce yourself, give us your background, and tell us how you got here.
Okay. Well, I was born and raised in Scotland, and there's a whole part of my work that's associated with my connection to Scotland and to the indigenous people there, which I am one of them. And I actually do tours of stone circles in Aberdeenshire. So I just got back from Scotland and doing a tour with some clients. So that's another part of my life. My father, who is 99, wrote a couple of books about the stone circles of Aberdeenshire. And so all my life I've gone around stone circles. So that's centersofearthmagic.com. But I went to university in Edinburgh, and I have undergraduate in biology. And I sort of specialized in the end of that in cell biology, and I went on to do a PhD. And even though it was actually in it was in obstetrics and gynecology, and I have a PhD in medicine. I was mainly doing studies on gametes. And so I was doing a lot of microscopy. And I went and did a postdoc at Cornell Medical School in Manhattan. And I was working with their in vitro fertilization group. And again, I was doing a lot of microscopy. I was doing light and fluorescence and scanning and transmission electron microscopy. And actually, what was a downer about that was I was spending a lot of time in a windowless room in Manhattan. And that was when you're 26, I wasn't really doing it for me. But the first place I visited in America was Ojai, which is where I live now. I'd come over to Ojai in 1985 to visit a friend, and I really liked it. And after my postdocing, I decided to move over here and help my friends who had a small farm. And I went from doing research to doing construction and being a farmer. The thing that attracted me to the backcountry, to Southern California, was actually the backcountry. And in Ventura County in Los Padres Forest, there is a fantastic wild river, the Sespe Creek. And I got involved in backcountry protection. And we actually got Sespe Creek designated as a wild and scenic river in the mid 1990s. And so that was huge. At that time, it wasn't mandated to have curbside recycling. And so I worked with a nonprofit that did that. And I also was really into organic gardening and farming. My dad's family were farmers in Aberdeenshire, and I'd grown up with potatoes and strawberries and rhubarb and blackberries in the backyard. So I definitely had a background in gardening, let's say. But a thing that brought everything together for me was that I did a permaculture design course in 1997, and it was funny. The only thing I could really find to do in Ojai at that time was teaching. And I was teaching biology, chemistry, and environmental science at an independent school. And they said, there's this thing going on in summer. You'll have to do it. And I was like, oh, okay. And it was a permaculture design course. And it was Bill Mollison was the teacher. And so Bill came over, and it was an epic course. There was about 100 people there. And I made a lot of connections with people that I still have connections with. And it really brought everything together. And I think that's one of the core things that I understand now, that is everything's connected. And it's a nice connection between both scientific thought as ecologists and also indigenous thought. And both of those realms say everything's connected. And so permaculture design course brought that together for me, and I formed a permaculture guild in town, and then a few years later, we incorporated a nonprofit with a local farmer, Steve Sprinkle, who is the president, I believe, of the Ecological Farming Association still, which puts on the Eco Farm conference each year in Asilomar. And we formed in 2002, we formed the Center for Regenerative Agriculture. And regenerative agriculture was not a buzz term in 2002. And I ran that nonprofit for 20 years. And now there are several places that are call themselves Center for Regenerative Agriculture, which is kind of cool because we really had the realization that everywhere needs a Center for Regenerative Agriculture, particularly around connecting the cycle of life. And that, I think, Leighton, is something you can totally relate to, is the importance of composting and making that connection. So I did a lot of education around about soils, and I connected with our friend, the soil queen of the soil, Elaine Ingham, and I went to a workshop that she did actually at a Permaculture Voices conference in, I think, about 2010. And I had the idea, oh, we should just invite her to Ojai to do some workshops here. And so I hosted Elaine, I think, 5 times, and we did week-long courses with Elaine. And the best one was really all about microscopy, where people who brought microscopes came and did microscopy. And out of that, we continue to educate people about soils and soil food web and the importance of organic agriculture. And I'm doing that to adults and to children. But at the meantime, I was also doing education programs, which at their core are about connecting kids to nature. And actually, one of my favorite ways to connect kids to nature is to have them sieve compost at school gardens. I built these sieves that would fit over a wheelbarrow, and then kids would sieve the compost. And it wasn't so much about the compost they were producing, it was about the biology that was running around in there. And they'd catch the critters, and we do little basic stuff there, how many legs does it have, what do you think it eats, and there was such engagement at that age. I mean, and we're talking here first, second, third grade, 5, 6, 7 year olds, 8-year-olds, and just the fascination they have with living things was really fantastic. So in terms of connecting kids to nature, composting is a wonderful thing to do it with. But I run an education program that includes soils and composting, but is really about our watersheds and connecting kids to nature. And so currently I work in Ventura County with about 28 schools, I think it is currently. And that's all stuff that I do nonprofit, that I raise money to do. I write grants and collaborate with folks. But in 2016, I formed a business. And the business I have, Regenerative Designs Ojai, I do consults, I do education, but I primarily make and brew actively aerated compost tea for landscapers and arborists. And so that's kind of, I have a nonprofit realm, which is about education, connecting kids to nature. And then I have a for-profit realm that is based around soil food web and composting. That's what I got.
That's beautiful, dude. Like, most of that I knew. I did not know about the circles in Scotland.
Okay.
You know what? Let's go off script here a little bit. Tell me more about that. Is that
about stone circles?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, Neolithic Man inhabited Scotland, and we're talking here 5,000 to 5,500 years ago. And when we talk about stone circles, people usually have heard of Stonehenge. And Stonehenge is an atypical stone circle in the south of England. But in the northeast of Scotland, they have these stone circles that are called recumbent stone circles, because they have what we call an altar stone and 2 flankers, and they're pretty much always on the southeast of the circle, and tending to probably they framed some kind of I think, a lunar event. But there's a series of stories and also films called Outlander, and they use it's based in Scotland, and they use a stone circle as the time portal. So it's kind of fun to look at these places as, are they time portals? And in terms of working as time portals, I'm there and I'm remembering Neolithic Man 5,500 years ago, moving these huge stones, which weigh, an enormous amount. And there's like 70 of them in Aberdeenshire. I mean, it really was active. In fact, they've just found out that one of the stones in Stonehenge actually came from the north of Scotland, 450 miles. And how Neolithic Man managed to move, or Neolithic people managed to move those huge rocks, we don't really know. So anyway, it's a fun way to visit an area, is to go and look at areas that Neolithic Man thought was special. And that's where I came up with the name Centers of Earth Magic, because obviously these guys were where they put the circle was important to them, and we don't know why they put the circle there. So I usually, as a scientist, avoid using the term magic, but we have no idea what Neolithic Man was resonating to in order to choose the sites. So that's why I came up with Centers of Earth Magic.
That is so cool, dude. Yeah, I saw that article that said that one of the stones had been traced back to Scotland, 450 miles away.
Yeah.
To a quarry. And the question is, like you said, how could they have possibly moved that? We don't even have cranes big enough now to do it.
We actually, when I was touring in July, I went up to Orkney, and Orkney is an archipelago of islands off of the north of Scotland, and it's a fantastic place. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site called the Neolithic Heart of Orkney, and there the stones are like flagstones. They're easily, they break up into linear forms, and one of the suggestions was that they used rollers, trees, but they also used seaweed to enable the movement of these massive rocks. So that was one of the tour guides that I ran into up there when I was asking about that. But yeah, it's a bit of a mystery, and we really have no idea. And I like the term mystery, actually, because that's my story. So you can make up any story you want, and it's my story. It's a mystery rather than his story, right? Which is history. So,
right.
So I like the my story part. So you can go there, and there are definitely places that are contemplative, and it is really I enjoy going around. I mean, I've gone around them all my life, so it's nice to introduce other people to these areas. And some of them are well protected and are well known, and other ones you really have to know about. And that's the work that my dad did, was that he really tracked down a lot of these sites and explored areas. And in the 19th century, a lot of these things were obliterated or damaged, or they reused the rocks for other things. But now, of course, they're protected. So
there were actually a lot more that were lost.
Yeah, that probably. I mean, when you look at it, they have a thing in Britain, the Ordnance Survey maps, and you can get the historic Ordnance Survey maps from the 19th century, and they show a lot of tumuli, they call them, or earth mounds, or standing stones, or stone circles. And so using these old maps, my dad was going and exploring around and finding these things. It's a great way to get to know your neighborhood.
Oh, right. Did he take you along with him when he was exploring?
Yes, yeah. So when I was a kid, we do a lot of that. My mom would complain about it. Oh, it's another Ricola stones, she'd say, and my old man would be out there, and he'd be measuring them and taking photographs, and he kept meticulous records. We actually had to move him out of his house recently because he's 97. He couldn't live on his own anymore. And I was going through all his notes, and it was just amazing how meticulous he was in his cross-referencing. I mean, his day job, he worked for the government, and this was just his passion, and he was really into it. That and golf and jazz.
Well, golf I can see. Jazz is a little bit out there.
I know, it's funny. Golf is Scotland's joke on humanity.
Right.
and jazz. He got into black jazz at the beginning of the Second World War, and he was in like he worked the teleprinters, and so he built his own amplifier and record deck, and he carried around 78s and sounded like he had a pretty good. And he was based in Orkney, actually, so he had a pretty good time as a young man.
Wow, that is really cool, dude. So has anybody ever looked at ley lines and how maybe they're part
yeah, there certainly is. I haven't really explored that too much. I do, like, there's people who really get into measuring the distances between the stones and the heights of the stones and the orientation and everything. And I really prefer just to go there and sort of feel what it feels like, like just to be present. And so I was much more trying to be attuned to just the earth magic, just the feeling of being there. There is a thing called the Megalithic Yard that this guy, Alexander Thom, came up with, and it's about a pace, not surprisingly, like 2.6 feet or something. Yep. And he did a lot of measurements and came up with that. And then the ley line thing, certainly there are folks who are proponents of that. My dad wasn't a big fan of that. Who knows? There's so much mystery about nature, and trying to understand it is tricky. It's like it's beyond us. It's really a complicated thing. So again, reverting to that mystery, you could make up a mystery about ley lines, sure.
Yeah. Interestingly enough, the seaweed idea too, that's really cool. So they create that slime, that biofilm.
Yeah. Interestingly, in Orkney, they used to burn seaweed to make an alkaline soot that was used to make glass and soap. And that was a really pretty toxic industry in the 1800s. And then when petroleum came in, that industry, the bottom fell out of it. But we also used in Scotland, kelp, or seaweed was used as a natural fertilizer a lot. And I still use liquid kelps in my compost tea, that's for sure. So there's a tradition of using seaweeds that's in Scotland.
Yeah, the very first thing I did when I got out here 2 days before they shut the world down for COVID. And so right after they shut the world down, I was like, well, I'm not going anywhere and I need compost. And I'm living 1 minute from the ocean, and I walk down there and there's kelp everywhere. I'm like, oh my God, this place is a gold mine. So I started fermenting kelp within a week of getting here and using that to help build the compost. So I get the value of it. It's an amazing plant for sure.
And I'm curious about, I know that there are folks who harvest kelp, and there's now people who are actually growing kelp. So they'll put out lines and they seed those lines with kelp, and it's such a fast growing organism. It seems like you could go through with like some kind of underwater lawnmower, kelp mower, and harvest it. I mean, I can't remember how, it grows like 3 feet a day or something. I mean, it really is a vigorous thing. And so actually there's definitely, I'm sure some of your viewers know that kelp is viewed as being like one of the ultimate regenerative plants because it's fixing carbon and it's growing so fast. So it is interesting to look at kelp as a natural input, and especially you've got all your minerals and micronutrients that you're taking from the ocean. Probably a lot of microplastic too now.
That's a good question. I don't know if it would metabolize it, but with that kind of growth rate, you would think that it would be easily absorbed in as the plant was, cellular to cellular growth or expansion. But that's a really good question. But and I'll be honest with you, and I'm glad you brought up microplastics because there's so much hate in the industry of compost related to microplastics and And my take was, like, hey, we got to start dealing with what we've done, and everybody's got microplastics in your body. I'm sorry, you do. Whether you want to admit it to yourself or not. So can you hate microplastics? No, because they're part of your body. If you hate them, you're hating yourself.
Mm.
So we need to kind of embrace this, and the latest work coming out from scientific research on both the grand garbage patch out in the Pacific, as well as a lot of local startups that are using bacteria to break down these plastics, is that in fact it's happening naturally, like just in my own compost piles that I make up at Peach Hill. Like I have a very fine screen, which I think you saw, that I use to screen the compost out to get any plastics that I can see out of it before I ship it. I'm seeing I'm seeing degraded plastics. Like they are consuming it. So
Well,
I think,
yeah, with fungi being able to break down carbon-carbon bonds, then that's my hope, is that your fungi are breaking down plastics as well as other, toxic chemicals that are in the environment. And, we are learning more and more about fungi all the time. And I think that it really, our fungal allies are, are really what we should hope would be helping us with this. It wasn't. I sometimes do these soil food web community composting events where people can bring samples of their own soil, and then we'll put it on the microscope and show it on the big screen. And it was interesting. I had somebody come from who brought a sample of like the Berkeley yard waste compost, and I put it under the microscope, and it was very obvious that there was plastic in it, but it was tiny. And, you just don't see orange and blue things in nature very often. And it's like, okay, these are little bits of plastic. And so it is a curio. One of the things that I wonder if, they have estrogenic properties. And so I wonder if a lot of the gender confusion that's going on now is because of the plastics that we're ingesting that have estrogenic effects, for instance. I mean, and that's just, who knows?
that and atrazine. Atrazine has been shown to reverse male frogs. I don't know if you knew that, but atrazine was like an incredibly popular pesticide 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And there's still, of course, a lot of legacy residues in the soils that are being uptaken by plants. So I agree with you. I mean, I think the amount of hormone disruptors, hormone blockers that are present in food preservatives, packaging, it's just off the charts. And so as far as like, the mental balance of both men and women, like there's just as many testosterone blockers and disruptors. That's a main concern as far as why there's this gender confusion. And it's pretty primarily among Americans, more so than a lot of other places on the planet. I mean, do they have that same scenario in Scotland where there's a lot of confusion?
Yes, I think Scotland's dealing with it in a way that is a little different from England, but I'm not really very well versed in that, Leighton, and it's a bit of a minefield to get into that. I mean, I tread very carefully on issues around about gender. So I was at a meeting last night, and somebody was complaining about the fact that now it was about returning to school. And now schools can advise children about gender change, and they don't have to inform the parents. And if the parent gets involved, the parent's actually breaking the law, is what they're telling me. And they were upset about that. But fortunately, it's not an issue for me. And this is coming from a guy who grew up wearing a kilt. So,
Love it, dude. Love it. It is. Those types of topics really are minefields at this point in time.
They are, and that's why it's nice to get back to composting. And so how we've connected is through microscopy and composting and compost teas and compost extracts. And I'm very impressed with what you're trying to do at Peach Hill's soils with limited resources. You said you don't have power, and you've got limited water, and you're you are making high quality compost there.
Yeah, I mean, one of the first things I did the first year I got there, I was trying to use a water truck. Dude, it was nuts. I could never get it right. I either was flooding everything out, or the guys forgot to leave the truck up top, or it was empty, or the pump broke, and then I'd have to go down and chase them around. Sometimes be there 4 or 5 hours before I could get the water truck back up there, and it was brutal. I was able to pull off a couple of jobs, but those were, basically production in and out the door in 3 months. So, and I was doing that more so over the winter, which I, again, was so blessed. The last 2 years we've had wet winters. So it wasn't like, prior years where you didn't get any rain. So in that regard, it was a real challenge, but that's why I, as soon as I got a couple bucks put together, I put those 2 cisterns up on the hill so that I would have a regular ability to regularly water. And even still, it's a challenge, Dave, because like today, Alex has been promising me for a week now that he'd fill me up, and I'm down to a point where one of the piles I can't water anymore because I don't have enough pressure. And he promised he's going to fill it up tonight, and then I got to be there in the morning anyway, so I'll chase him around if he didn't. But it's a challenge, it really is. And then on top of that, you add in the UV, you add lack of humidity and the constant breeze. And I have never seen anything like this. I come from New England. All I got to do is build the pile, throw some seeds on it, walk away. 6 months later, the shit is rocket fuel. So I had one hell of a learning curve coming out here, in Southern California and dealing with conditions I was not used to and had never even anticipated. Yeah,
it's super dry here, that's for sure.
Now, up in Ojai, at least you've got some shade, right? Or are you full sun?
Well, we have our oak woodland, and that's another thing. Everything's connected. So I actually, one of the initiatives that I brought to Ventura County was Oaktober, and I see that coming up there. And Oaktober is Oak Awareness Month, and yes, I've got an Oaktober event on October 5th, where I'm going to be visiting with oaks and walking around oaks. But one of the big things that's happening with climate change is that we're getting climate migration, right? And species are moving north where it's cooler, but the oaks can't move fast enough. So we're getting a lot of oak dieback. And so interestingly, I was looking at some photographs I took of an area in Ojai where I was living when I came over here in 1985, and that area is now being developed. And so I went out and I took some other pictures of basically the same thing almost 40 years later, and the oak canopy has declined greatly. I had not a client, but somebody came to a talk that I gave, and they came up and asked a question in the end, and they said, I've lived on this area on Sulphur Mountain in Ojai, which has got fantastic oak woodland. I mean, it's an oak coast live oak forest. And she said, I've lived there 60 years and I've never seen so many oaks come down as they're coming down now. What can I do about it? And basically I had to say, grieve for the changes of climate change. There's one of my friends, you should meet Dave Muffley, whose website is oaktopia.org, and he's an oak expert. He did all of the plantings for the Apple Cupertino site, which is a circular building with all these box trees. And he really is very, very knowledgeable about oaks. And he's done a lot of work to promote assisted climate migration for oak trees. And he's saying we should be using species that are just further south, like Engelmann oak, which would move up into this area if we're getting, because it's more able to deal with heat and drought stress. And so, yeah, we have shade here because I've got, coast live oak right above the office here. Actually, one in the neighborhood just came down. I saw summer branch drop, right, is what they call it. But the climate change is real, and oaks, we have history. We can look at pollen patterns and we can see that oaks move back and forth depending on, interglacial periods, or you've got glaciation, they move further south. And so it's just the pace of climate change that we're moving through right now is so fast that the trees can't keep up. And and this is one of the things that I'm challenged with getting through to people, is about the speed of climate change. And when, indigenous groups talk about 7 generations, and if you go back 7 generations, even if you call that 30 years, which is maybe, you're only getting back to sort of the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And in that 7 generations, there's just been massive changes on our planet. And so when you start thinking, what's it going to be like in 7 generations in the future? What's it going to be like where we are in 250 years? And our vegetation patterns are going to be probably very, very different. It seems like the change is so rapid. I saw a comment come up on the bottom there about using oak leaves in compost, and I do that for sure. And that's one of the things. I actually make my compost specifically for treating coast live oaks. And so I incorporate their oak leaves, which are falling all around. I mean, basically, they just about go into my compost out of the tree. But I also use what they call ramial wood chips, which is small diameter wood chips from branches that are 2.5 inches diameter or less. And those are have unpolymerized lignans in them. And so they're much more of a food. And it's important to point out that not all mulches are equal. And for here, for instance, if I can get eucalyptus trunk chips, and those are great on pathways because they'll never break down. We just don't have the biology here, it would seem like, to break down the eucalyptus. I have rounds of eucalyptus that I've had for 20 years that are still like blocks of steel. But if you had a round of oak, it would completely be, degraded by now, because it would have been broken down by all the fungi and bacteria that are in the atmosphere and want to colonize that. So I encourage people to use native inputs, the native carbon input to their compost. And I think that's pretty important. And then whenever I often get people who have feature trees in their landscape and they're ailing, sometimes because they've done some trenching or there's compaction, they park their car underneath them, or they built a deck around them or something. And very much I say, well, go and visit your favorite healthy oak tree and get some of the biome from around that tree, and then make a liquid of it and apply it to your tree. And that's basically what I'm doing with the compost, just adding a little bit more biology to it. And I'm also adding the Microrizy. I look for the Microrizy that are specific for the trees that I'm treating. And interestingly here, the Microrizy for coast live oak is Pisolithus arisis, which we commonly call dead man's foot. And it's this kind of ugly looking puffball. And it's amazing because when I first found out that was the mycorrhizal ally for coast live oak, I purchased some, and it was very expensive. But now when I start to recognize it and can see it growing, I've got a bunch of them, actually. I've got some up here. And I grind them on a mesh, and the spores are tiny. The spores are like 7 microns across. And so when you grind it, it's like smoke that's coming off. 2 billion spores per gram. And so when if you can get those onto the roots of young trees, then you've started that mycorrhizal association from the get-go. And so we do with kids. We'll plant acorns in Oaktober as our celebration of Oaktober, and we'll coat the acorn in some mycorrhizae, and so it's inoculated for when you plant it.
That's awesome, and that's the ecto version, not the VAM.
Yes, yeah, and it's so interesting that I get now. I don't have it in here, but oh yeah, I do. You turn me onto this stuff. Bioradis Soul, yep. Right? And this is about this high quality a mycorrhizal amendment as you can get. It's imported from Spain, but still the numbers of mycorrhizal spores in here pale into insignificance by comparison to actually having the mycorrhizal fruiting body and grinding it and putting it into your, like what we do is we'll have an arborist who has a tank and a pump and a probe, and we water the tree, and then we go around and we inject around about the drip line, and I'll give them the Microrizy to put into the tank just before they pump it in. And the idea is then it's annealing with the roots as it can. But it's often you'll see, like I just saw it at a nursery I was visiting, and they have soil, and it says with Microrizy, and it says Microrizy in big letters, but I bet you, it's how much Microrizy is in there is the question I have, and that's why the Bioratus is a good product. It's expensive.
Well, the crazy thing is that anybody can claim that they have Microrizy in their product because of the spores are blowing in.
Yeah, they're everywhere.
They're everywhere. So, that's the greenwashing that really upsets me. I mean, I had a conversation with one of the largest producers of bagged soil in the country, and he had the same thing. Oh, with Microrizy and without. I'm like, dude, what is this, right? Seriously, it's the same damn product, and it. You just put Microrizy on the label on this one, and you don't on that one, so people think they're getting a better product. And long story short, I lost a friend, but
yeah,
it tends to be the way things are when you call people out. But bottom line is, the interesting part about Bioratus is not only is it by far the highest quality inoculant that I've ever found, but they always have more spores than they have on the label. And
yes.
So what I always do is every batch I get, because I usually get it by the case, is I'll have Efren randomly pull out a couple samples from a couple different bottles and then do the spore counts. And the reason I do that is because I'm more interested in application rate. Because if you have way more than you need in your application, well, that's a waste, because there's only so many sites that it can infect. So if you're putting on 10 times what can affect it, that's a waste of the product. And let's face it isn't cheap.
It's expensive.
Yeah, it's not cheap, but it goes a long way. Yeah. And the other thing too is, when I first got into Microrizy, I was using, I'm going to go ahead and say it, Micro Apply. And that was the renowned Microrizy spores back in 2010, 11, 12. And I just got curious, and so I sent in some samples to Efren and had him do the count. One of them came back with non-viable spores. The other one came back with no spores. And I was pissed, because I paid $60 a bag for this stuff. And, and to have a product that had no, verification, no quality control. And after that, I sent in every sample I could get to see who was the best. And finally, I went back to Efren and I go, Efren, I'm spending a friggin' fortune on you. Is there a better way that we can do this? Like, can you advise me on which products that you've analyzed, so that I could just, kind of cut to the chase, which he's not technically supposed to do, but because we were good friends, he did start steering me into products that he knew were viable. And I think the biggest thing that separates Bioratus from any other producer, first of all, people need to know that there's really only one producer, and everybody else is getting white labeled the same product. Mm-hmm. That product is grown in vitro, so it's grown in a lab, where Bioratus is grown in vivo, so it's grown in grass fields in Spain, under the sun, exposed to the weather. And so that way the spores are way more viable, because as soon as you throw a spore that was grown in vitro into the soil, the chances of it are surviving are probably 50% at best, because it was spoiled. It was grown up in the perfect environment, perfect food, perfect temperature. When does that happen in nature, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's why I went down the rabbit hole of like, all right, who's got the best product? What can I guarantee to work? And every time I've used it and sent back in root samples, which is another big mistake that most clients don't do, I would get high colonization. And the goal is, like, if you do an application, say you get a 20% colonization, your goal is really to get up to a 40, and after 40, it really doesn't matter anymore. Pretty much if you did colonize, which most times you can't even get that high, it could actually become parasitic because it's not providing enough to the tree. It's just stealing exudates. So needless to say, you know, if you do root hair samples, now you can say, oh shit, I got to do another application, or, oh good, I'm all set. As long as nobody uses any poisons or synthetics, that Microrizy will be here for forever, literally.
One of the books that I just read is Merlin Sheldrake's book, Entangled Life. And that really, I think he's actually produced two versions. One is a sort of abridged version that has lots of beautiful photographs in it. But the unabridged version actually goes into a lot more depth. So don't be confused, but Entangled Life, highly recommend it. And what's interesting is that, and this relates a little bit to our plastics conversation, is that they find that they can actually kind of train mushrooms to eat very specific things. Like he talks about raising mushrooms that will live on cigarette butts. And it's you know, and of course the classic one is the living off of diesel fuel. You know, that oyster mushrooms can break that down. And so, you know, again, I think that the more that we can recognize the importance of fungi and realize that fungi enabled plants to evolve, that fungi have been around 400 million years. I mean, how 400 million years? Like, how the heck do we imagine that?
I think the latest is 1.6 billion.
So they've been around a long time, but they're before plants, and so the majority of plants have these mycorrhizal allies, and you know, that's important for people to recognize, because we tend to have mycophobia. You know, it's like mushrooms are something that are deadly and we can't go near them. You know, and they really are so vitally important, and that gets back to, you know, the sort of things that I'd be promoting with regenerative agriculture about no-till perennials, not using pesticides, herbicides, chemical fertilizers. And a lot of that's about breaking up the soil beds, which are held together by fungi. And that whole, you know, the existence of carbon in the soils, like 30% of it is glomalin, which is the glues that fungi produce that hold together soil beds. And that's enabling air and moisture to get into soil. And it's that moisture in a space where you have moisture and a surface of moisture, that's where life is happening. That's where the soil food web is happening. And you need to have moisture getting in there. And so, I mean, this is all, you know, coals to Newcastle for you, but it's important to recognize the importance of fungi in our lives. And I think there's a whole bunch more that we can find out about. I mean, people are making packaging that you can grow packaging out of mushrooms, and then it's totally biodegradable. And, you know, I mean, one of the things that we should probably get onto with composting is that in California in 2027, it's going to be legal to compost human bodies. So that's going to be interesting. I know that there's been some move towards making caskets that have mycelium in them, and you know, that so you can be broken down by your casket. But actually composting the body is something that is happening now in the US, and it's a big change, because we used to just bury people, which is, you know, land intensive, or we burn them, which is, you know, putting carbon in the atmosphere, and we know that we need to not do that. So composting is producing, it's the process that people are interested in, you know, and the output is for soil remediation, you know, and it's like, what a thing. So 2027, that's going to be legit in California. It's already legal in Washington. And Recompose is the website. Recompose.life is a website to go and check out. And yeah, there's that's going to be an interesting thing. The group, I think the group in Washington that's doing that, basically, from what I can gather, is that they kind of put the body in it's a bit like a pressure cooker. They put it in a sealed vessel. They put in hot water, wood chips, and alfalfa, and then I guess it liquefies the muscle and then the bones, and are ground, right? Which is what they do with crematoriums too. I was just talking to a green burial funeral director, and there's a whole bunch of stuff that I had no idea about.
Yeah. So another really interesting product before we get into bodies, they're making boats out of it. They're literally growing fungi around these molds and making boats. I mean,
it's fascinating, the things that we can get up to with fungi. So yeah, Entangled Life, I think Merlin Sheldrake, the work that he's done there is really great. He's getting a lot of traction in the UK. The book is beautiful. Highly recommend it. Good read. Unputdownable, just like the book on helium, right? Unputdownable.
Yep. No, agreed. And these kinds of resources need to be, talked about, because you're absolutely right. I mean, it opens the minds to all kinds of potentials. Like, maybe there's a kid or a college graduate looking for something to do, or a hobby or whatever, and you turn them on to some of these crazy ideas. They're like, wait, I could grow a boat with mushroom?
No, I know that. I mean, it is. I mean, here I'm now in my 60s, and definitely we're beginning to turn things over to the next generation. I was out this morning with a 30-year-old who's now running the nonprofit that I'm the treasurer for, Keep the Sespe Wild, and it's so great to have young people that are engaged and interested, in this instance, about backcountry protection. But that sort of excitement exists around fungi. And I've got a young friend who I've known since he was in his mother's womb, and he's actually quoted in Merlin Sheldrake's book as being one of the people that Merlin thanks for input. So it's nice to see the next generation coming through and embracing new ideas and being excited about it. His name is Rascal Turbyville. So shout out to Rascal if he's
all right.
Rascal.
Good man. Yeah, I am like literally surrounded by 30 somethings. They call me their. They want me to mentor them, so I guess that makes me the mentor, or I forget how that works. But
yeah, they're the mentees.
They're the mentor. Yeah, so I mean, it's an honor, and the excitement and the drive, and I'm slowing down, and they're going a million miles an hour. So it's like so refreshing to get re-energized by not only their creativity but their drive to move the needle.
And I think that's where regenerative agriculture really got people interested in being able to do something that would make a difference. And I know the two documentaries that really sparked that was Kiss the Ground and Biggest Little Farm. Mm-hmm. And both of those I saw create a sort of groundswell of interest in people who weren't trying to make money out of the landscape. So people realizing, by composting and growing food in my own yard, I'm actually doing something that's beneficial to the planet. And, I call it the Shantaram principle, to think about if what you did, if everybody did it, would it be a good thing? And that enables me to be like, okay, I'm going to recycle this bit of metal. I keep a whole pile of metal and eventually I recycle it, and that sort of thing. And there's a great book, Shantaram, which is really about India and like crime in India. It's sort of a trippy book, but the guy puts this principle out about thinking about if everybody in the world did what I'm doing, would it be a good thing? So engaging the next generation is key. And so that gets back to the core of what I'm doing. And it's so important that kids connect to nature. And we know so much about the healing effects of nature. And particularly, I'm moving on like the green schools movement. And so I really want schools to have shade trees and food gardens and native habitat, but I also want them to be reducing their atmospheric carbon contribution by using using systems that are using recyclable, regenerative systems, for solar and then cleaning products. And, I actually am going around at the moment, the school districts I work with, asking them to develop climate action plans.
Nice.
And, and those are things that students can get engaged in. And it's giving students a sense of hope when they see the folks who are tuned into climate change and they have a sense of things like plastic pollution and all of the negative issues that are associated with our changing climate. Regenerative ag gives them a sense of hope. It gives them something they can do. And, so the basic part of that for me is thinking about your output. What are you going to, what happens to your output, and how can you make that a resource? And so I love it that my compost, the waste from my kitchen, becomes the food for my worms, which then become a product that I'm actually making some income from. So that's a regenerative system. And a good thing to notice with regenerative system is unintended good consequences, which I would say is a connection with you as an unintended good consequence. That's a symptom of working in regenerative, working in regenerative systems is a symptom of that is unintended good consequences. And the opposite of that is unintended bad consequences. And that's what happened if you're working in degenerative systems. Locally, we have citrus, and the citrus growers have this, it's called Huanglongbing. It's a disease, citrus greening disease, and it's carried by a vector, which is a fly. And so they want to use neonicotinoids to kill the fly, and those kill the pollinators that they require to pollinate their crop. So that's an example of a degenerative system where you get unintended bad consequences. But, for instance, I set up worm bins at schools, and the unintended good consequences there was we had salamanders appear in the bins, and the kids, oh my goodness, frogs too, unintended good consequences. Going to the farmer's market is usually a regenerative system, because there's always some conversation that comes up. I had no idea of planning it, but you usually meet somebody and you have a chat, and that's unintended good consequences. So inspiring the youth of the next generations, though, that's important work. And I feel fortunate to have that as a guiding principle. And it keeps on coming back. It seems like it's important. How can the next generation protect nature if they don't know what it is?
Or they don't get their hands dirty, or don't get exposed to it. The feelings.
If we can do that at schools, then that's perfect, because we do take kids out on field trips, but actually having schools become community green centers, that's a good way forward. Community schoolyards, all that sort of thing. So that's something.
And they get excited too. I mean, let's face it, when they get to see that little frog or that salamander that they've never seen before, I mean, that's a special moment.
You should see the engagement I get with kids around the compost when they're screening compost. I mean, it's a teacher's dream to have a whole class engaged in something, and you're not doing anything. You just provided them the means to do some learning, and you can stand back and these kids are sieving compost and they're catching bugs and they're trading them. And I've got some great videos of that. It's pretty fun. Yeah.
Back in the day, I used to go to the Bantam grade school with fish and worm castings and compost. And I would basically say, look, if you mix these together, like if you have an aquarium at home, you take the filter from the aquarium and you squeeze it in this bucket, and then you add this worm castings and you add the compost, and then you stir it up. And I would do this in the classroom, let the kids all throw a handful in, and then give them a bottle of compost tea to go home with at the end of the day and water their plants. And oh my God, I used to get letters from the parents like, oh my God, thank you so much. My kid is so excited. He wants to start his own worm bin, blah, 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 blah. Right. So yeah, that was like some of the most rewarding work that one can do is spark the life of a kid is, very, very powerful thing. So I'm psyched you got up to how many schools? 28 now?
At the moment, 28. Yeah. And some of the schools we present curriculum to kindergarten, where the kindergarten lesson is so much fun because we're getting kids to embody plants and animals of their watershed. We have a wonderful book that was made by my artist friend, Diane Bennett, and we show them the animals and plants that live in the watershed, and then they get to be those animals and plants. They get to be condors, they get to be herons, they get to be steelhead trout, they get to be oak trees. And this imagination it's so important, and it's really fun to teach that class. And then fourth grade, we have story of our oak, so kids are planting acorns and visiting oak trees. To get kids to sit with oaks is really a special thing. Our fifth grade program is story of our estuary, super biologically diverse areas, and we have a focus on plastic pollution. We have some of the real leaders in the plastic awareness, raising awareness about plastic pollution, live locally. Anna Cummins and Marcus Erickson, who were Five Gyres, and they now are Leap Lab. And Marcus made his book is called Junk Raft, and he made a raft out of like recycled bottles and things like that, and he sailed to Hawaii in it. Incredible. And
Wow.
He's a shout out to those guys who live in Santa Paula. He's a Iraq veteran. He's a PhD paleontologist, and he's an iron sculptor. And so when you go to his place, which is actually Steve McQueen's old ranch, it's got like these metal T-Rexes,
dinosaurs. Yeah, I've seen it.
Yeah, those guys are doing wonderful work, and it's raising awareness about that. So it's important that we point out. Like, one of the things that amazes me, I've taught hundreds of classes of fifth graders, and I'll ask them, what is oil made of? What is plastic made of? And 95% of them don't know that plastic is made of oil. And that's just a very important thing. That's probably the most important thing they need to recognize. Oh, okay, this is oil pollution. In our sixth grade program, we have a dam in our local watershed that's completely blocking the passage of endangered steelhead fish. And it's also blocking all the passage of sediment to the beaches. So we got coastal erosion, and the local supervisors have agreed to remove that dam. They agreed in 1998. It's still there, 160-foot piece of concrete in the middle of the watershed. So that's something that we take students up to. And yeah, it's really a conundrum. I think basically they're waiting for an act of God, that if we have the big earthquake, that it will come down. So
now,
yeah,
didn't they just tear one down last year?
Yeah, so there's like the Condit Dam and the Elwha Dam. Those of both are big dams that have been removed. The Matilaha Dam, which is the one locally, when we first were approaching removing it, there hadn't been any other large dam removals, but now there are. But it's interesting working with county bureaucracy and to see how complicated it seems to get this dam out. And it is completely full. It's a 160-foot dam, and it's completely full of sediment to the top. 8 million or 9 million cubic yards of sediment. And that's why we have coastal erosion. So, interesting.
And you've lost a tremendous amount of diversity, kelp, crabs, shrimp, all of those things that rely on that silt constantly flowing down as a source of fertility. So yeah, humanity really depresses me at times, especially when you get into like the bureaucratical, not in my backyard, or I know what I'm doing, the ego sets in. And here's a really good thing that would be beneficial to the environment and the people that are living here. And you're going to kill it. You're not going to allow it to happen. That gets me, gets my blood boiling.
It's interesting. I think it's in Bolivia or Peru that rivers have rights, and it's interesting to look at the rights of nature. And so, when you have a dam, it's, completely destroys the riparian ecosystem. And so it is interesting to think about the rights of nature. And a lot of what comes down, it seems like a lot of what motivates bureaucracies is legal input from lawyers. And so it just seems like actually we probably need more environmental legal expertise to force things like dam removal. I mean, here we are, we're 26 years since the county agreed to remove it, and it's still there. You know, why is it still there? And I think it's because the county believes that it's more of a risk to take it out than it is to leave it there. So, and it's all about, risk and the risk of being sued.
Well, leaving it there and then letting that silt cut loose when the dam breaks, that's an environmental disaster.
It's going to be interesting. It'll be a big slump.
Oh, God. And
we've had a couple of earthquakes recently, nothing massive, but we had a 5 point something here recently. That was quite a shock. That got me up and out of my desk, I'll tell you that.
Dude, I stood up and got thrown back in my chair. It scared the hell out of me. Like, that's my first real one. And I got I got almost seasick for like an hour after it. Like, I don't know, did that affect your like equilibrium as well?
No, I wouldn't say it did, but it certainly reminded me that we live in a close to some pretty major earthquake faults. I mean, the last big earthquake we had here was 93, was the Northridge earthquake. And that was a 6.9, I think it was. And that was a major thing that happened. And then there was the one up in 89. There was the one up in San Francisco. So yeah, I don't know, it could be tomorrow or it could be in 50 years, but there will be one, you know, or it could be, I don't know, who knows?
Right.
But we live in an earthquake zone, that's for sure.
Yeah, it is what it is, right?
Makes it exciting. So I'm curious about, so that the soil matters. I mean, it does. I keep on emphasizing that regenerative agriculture is based in the soil, and you can't really get away from the fact that plants and soil, you can't really separate soil and plants. They're together, right? You know, you need both. And it was interesting to hear you say that you were growing crops on, or not crops, but you were growing plants on your compost. And I think that's pretty cool to have, if you can do it, to have windrows and seed them. And yeah, more roots in the soil. It's because every plant, and I don't like the term weed, because every plant is taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and sticking it in the ground. All of them are non-judgmental allies. They're all nature-based climate solutions.
I actually changed the name. It's now, instead of weeds, it's medicinal plants for the soil.
All right.
I like to call them indicator plants, because they usually indicate what's missing in the soil. And there's a lot of books out there that basically tell you this plant is pulling this out of the soil to die, to make way for the next succession of plants to come into play. So
yeah, they all have their function. I wonder, do you want to talk about bricks at all? Seeing we just met with Michael Whitman.
Yeah. Before we go to bricks, so that was the key to my success in New England, was to take old rotten logs, just one to lay it down in the middle, and then take tender little new branches, like literally like 1 inch or less, but 5 feet long, and then weave them back and forth. So I made a tent. And then I would add 3 inches of hay, and then mix my greens and browns on top of it. And I'd add a compost extract. And then I would seed it with, flowers and local plants. And then once the seeds started to come up, and put a hay, of course, to protect the birds from, or prevent the birds from eating it. But once the seeds popped, then I'd run around and pick out little, like oak trees, pine trees. I put a lot of acorns on it, and man, for whatever reason, acorns and compost piles, those oak trees go ballistic. I mean, if you want to talk about getting seedling oak trees, that's the way to do it. Because When it's in the compost, it's so easy to pull the oak tree up. But you try to pull an oak tree sapling up in the forest where that taproot is down 4 feet and the tree's only this tall, forget it. It's a nightmare. So yeah, by cover cropping and planting indigenous little shrubs and any kind of weird flowers or grasses that I could find, my God, when I came back in 6 months, it was literally a teeming with microbes. So you're in the shade, you could easily do that. I mean, if you got one of Ron's like wildflower mixes or
Rincon Vitova and
and you just sprinkle those across the top of that compost. You don't want it thermophilic. It's got to be at least down below 110 degrees for those plants to germinate. But dude, when they germinate, they keep the moisture in. They throw miles of roots and rhizosphere. Build the tilth and get the air down, the moisture down. So in your situation, dude, I would highly encourage you to grow.
The problem I have here, because I'm in a suburban area, is that if I have exposed compost, then it will be raccoon playground and cat shitville, and I can't have cats shitting in my compost. So I have to keep my compost with in bins that have 1/2-inch hardware cloth underneath and on top. So I have grown things in my the bins. I use these what's it called, BioStack bins that you can't get anymore. They're fantastic. But I have a backyard. I'm not doing windrows. I'm doing backyard composting, and I have to be careful. I think that if you're going to get any issues with compost tea, it would be if you had fresh poo in your compost. And that's the sort of thing that if I had open piles, I'd have poo in my piles. So got to avoid that one. But, I think the idea of having plants when you can, seeding your compost really makes sense. And basically, the more seed we can get out there, the better. We did a lot of seed saving and seed swapping. And I actually have Rowan White, we don't own seeds, we borrow them from our children. Planting seeds of hope that will nourish our community and save seeds to share. I mean, that's really important work too. And again, that comes back to this concept of reciprocity. And this is something that we, I think the AA community talks about the attitude of gratitude, but reciprocity is about giving back. It's not all about taking. And we have in our culture, it tends to be take, especially from nature. And there's not much giving back. We could go into rant about corporations and how they are, we've been taken over by aliens. Corporations have the same rights as people, but they're non-cellular organisms. They are aliens, So we've been taken over by aliens and their corporations. And all of they're only interested in extraction.
Yep.
And, environmental effects are, externalities. And so embracing the concept of reciprocity is one that to point out to children, and being able to do something about your waste stream. That's a way to do it, because every day we're producing waste stream. And if you think about that one, then you have a bit more awareness about your effect on the planet, I think.
I agree with you 100%. And yeah, this extraction-based economy is one way or another going to come to an end, because it has to. It's gotten to the tipping point now that we're running out of places to hide and bury all the crap that we consume and store and try to hold on to. I mean, how many people have these sheds full of stuff?
Yes. Inventory.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's just absolutely crazy. But I don't hate them. I just understand that they were programmed by these commercials with the subliminal friggin' ads that make them think that they deserve all of these things. And
I think that a question is what is enough, or when is enough?
When's enough? It's really easy. When you come to the reality that you only need food, water, and cover.
Yeah. We're fortunate here. I am very grateful, and that attitude of gratitude gets me, a long way. And so I am very grateful with what I have. And I'm very fortunate too. My goodness, I live in Southern California, and it's pretty nice. I have a nice place, partner, kids, everybody's doing well. Nice community, bicycle around, walk around. Got tons of green space. That access to green space is a key indicator of health of community. So Ojai is really lucky. We've got a national forest behind us, and then the front country has all these land conservancy lands. And so actually getting back to what we can do, I think the work of land conservancies is really important. Protecting land from development and allowing public access, that's really a wonderful thing that land conservancies do. So we've got locally the Ojai Valley Land Conservancy and Ventura Land Trust. Those are both doing great work. Somewhat locally, we also have the White Buffalo Land Trust, and they're a land conservancy that also is doing regenerative agriculture. That's a nice crossover too. I've worked with White Buffalo Land Trust a little bit. They got like a 150-acre ranch up in Halama. And they're doing, I go and talk about nutrient cycling with them, and they're growing grapes, and they have some livestock, and they got a lot of oak woodland. So yeah, land trust, that's important work, protecting nature and enabling the next generation to experience it.
And another piece is like in my area, is convincing people to just throw in a little, we call them flushes of some local flowers or grasses or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, everybody's got little spots here and there that they can grow them, even if they're in containers. It doesn't matter. I mean, I took over a little section of the backyard here when I moved in. It was just basically a pile of sand. And I added some compost. I started regenerating it and then growing these mixes that I get from Ron.
Yeah.
And my God, I had like literally probably 50 different species of pollinators that I didn't recognize that came in and colonized the area. Butterflies of all different colors and sizes. A lot of different birds that I had never seen in the area came in and, were picking off the insects. But it was like that the little flush was alive. I mean, it was moving. There was so much activity constantly going on. And literally, like, anybody can do that, even in, these little tiny, where we barely have any footprint of land around the house. But that's trying to get the educational piece, in full force. And that's where, like, the kids come in. And I don't know if we did talk about this. I hope that we're having a big open house at Peach Hill.
Oh, when?
November 2nd. So
on my calendar.
Hold the date. And we're going to have 5 different workshops. One of them is going to be Kids Corner, where we take the recycled pots that Rob takes in to recycle. And we're going to get some seeds from the Heirloom Fest in September and have kids plant these little, plants, the flowers and stuff that they can put outside, that encourage the local pollinators to come in. And hopefully that kind of like takes hold with some of these kids and moms, that they say, hey, if one little pot looks this cool, why don't we just pick a little corner or make a little raised bed and do the same thing? And that's the kind of awareness that I think, would really help make the people in these communities, like where I live down here, where it's super crowded, to take that kind of initiative. And if, like you said, if everybody did it, like, there would be like, this would be a haven for other kinds of, expansion of the ecology and the local ecosystem.
Thanks for putting that. I put it on the calendar, and also a date that we've got coming up is November 13th. The Wednesday is our next compost tea party. And this, I think, is going to be our 6th compost tea party that we have at elementary schools. And it's put on by Florencia Ramirez, who wrote a book, Eat Less Water. And she's a pistol. She's really a great activist. And she has formed this pesticide-free soils coalition to work with schools. And so she teamed up with me to introduce schools to regenerative techniques. And at the compost tea parties, I've traditionally brewed up a big batch of tea, and I bring it and we treat certain areas. Certainly there any trees and raised beds and any lawn area that we can access. But we also have a whole bunch of other nature-based activities that students participate in. So it's a whole morning of nature-based activities that the school just embraces, and it's about introducing them to nature-based climate solutions. And I really appreciate, Leighton, that you shared our last one. You shared some of your high-quality compost with, I think that was Rio del Norte. This is all with the Rio district in Oxnard, and some of these schools are disadvantaged community, Title I schools, predominantly Spanish speaking, and just delightful to work with the children there. So thank you. And I hope that you can actually make it down to one of these compost.
I definitely think I can this year. There was some conflict that I had last
year.
Yeah,
you were doing a talk or something, but this school district actually has a 10-acre farm. And what's cool about that is that it's a regenerative farm. So their goal is not to make money out of it, is to educate about regenerative agriculture. So I think they're buying one of those GOT brewers. That's why I advised them to buy. And I know that you had concerns about him heating the pump heating the water, but in terms of a modular system that you can move around easily because it's based in an IBC tote, there, and it brews like 225 gallons at a time. And it's pretty efficient. You can just chuck the compost in, but I like the actual container that they use. It's very, very efficient in extracting stuff from compost. So they're doing cutting edge stuff, and we have put together some presentations with that school district so that other school districts could mimic and develop their own compost tea party. And again, it's coming back to these nature-based climate solutions. Always, though, at school districts, what we find is that the grounds and maintenance are understaffed and overworked, and they're also probably underpaid too. And so the people who are actually generally caring for the landscape in the schools are, they're busy, and they don't have the knowledge or time to embrace things like learning about what plants are, or like. One of the things that frustrates me is in community gardens is when the first thing that gets weed whacked is the nettles, because I love to make nettle pesto, which is a really healthy food, and yet nettles are viewed as being we gotta kill those. I actually where was it? I drove by today. Where was it? And there was like, it was at the Ojai Valley Inn. We have this very fancy inn in town which charges people a lot of money to stay the night, and it's super fancy. And there was a guy out in the front on a little electric cart with his spray bottle, spraying this little plant with, I'm assuming it was Roundup. And it was just such a classic image of how, and it was in order to have no plants growing in this area around their sign, which is, it's an area that's probably about a 1/4 acre, and it's just mulch. And so they didn't want anything growing in it, so they're spraying it with Roundup. Oh my God. Anyway.
Yeah, nettle is an amazing extract too. If you take nettle, put it in water, and then put some hardware cloth on top and keep it, make a ferment out of it.
Yes.
Talk about silica out the yin yang.
Definitely. And so that making plant extracts, nettle, comfrey, horsetail, that's getting into, the biodynamics.
Yeah. And natural farming, or Korean natural farming.
Yeah. And it's so interesting. Like when like Apricot Lane Farms, which is where the biggest little farm was filmed, they're biodynamic. And, there's a whole thing about biodynamic that I don't understand. It's like, okay, we're putting cow manure in a cow horn and we're burying it at midnight, and then we're digging it up. And I was like, okay, whatever. But biodynamic farms tend to look great. So there's something in it, and nature is complicated, and we don't know what the hell is going on.
It's funny you brought up biodynamics because once I started down this path at Rodale and this biological under soil biologist world, the first thing I did was look into biodynamics because I'm like, there has to be something to this. And some of his work, he got called out as a lunatic, woo woo, but he didn't have a microscope. We didn't have an understanding of soil microbes and fungi. So what he was describing as ethereal or fairies or that was his only way that he could explain this there's life in the soil to people. And so yes, the planting on the moons, I done a study where I was working on a project. I did moved a Japanese maple, big one. And so I marked a spot every day at the same time for 45 days. I took a soil sample just to see if there was a rhythm of biology, like an expansion and contraction during the full moon, new moon, and times in between. There was absolutely a correlation between the power of the new moon and the full moon. Both times I had a bacterial plume, and that, of course, drove the protozoa plume. So they were very much active during those 2 periods of time. So that's when I started saying, okay, biodynamics is legit. There's something to it. I don't know the rest of the answers. And that's when I started going down the 501 and the 503, which are the horns. One that you bury manure in the fall on the solstice, and you harvest that on the spring solstice or equinox. Fall and spring equinoxes. And then the other one you bury on the solstices, and that provides a different thing. I think it was sillet sand in the horn. It's been a while since I studied it. And once I looked through the horns and I started to look at the preps, because they have 12 different preps that they use at different times, I started to realize, like, wow, you know what? There has to be a lot more to this. I mean, the microbes in that horn, when you pick it up in the spring, it's an inoculant, dude. It's just loaded with
right.
And the soil smells like the forest floor. I mean, it's super rich, and it was just cow poop in a horn, right?
Yeah.
So there is definitely a lot to it, and the thing that drives me nuts more than anything is the biodynamic people are like, oh, you've got to be Demner certified, biodynamic, blah, 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 blah. It's all about biodynamics. Where the Korean natural farmers, oh, it's all about natural farming. And then they got the Jadam camp. Oh, it's all about Jadam. And it's like, no,
it's all about the biology. I see it.
We're all the same. We're all practicing these biological approaches to land care and land management. And
I like the prep thing, though, is interesting, and what you say about making the ferments is some people. I mean, it's fairly common that people will make putrefactions, right? They'll have a bunch of nettle, for instance, and put it in water, and then it putrefies, but it's still got the mineral content. It just stinks. I'd far rather use ferment and add some sugar, and it just smells nice. And I use that. I make plant extracts. And actually, Biggest Little Farm, Apricot Lanes, they have a ton of stuff. Then it's a little bit, they're not necessarily actively managing it, but they have some big drums of extracts down there where they've harvested a ton of stuff and then stuffed it in there. And there is so much I think anywhere in the world, there are plants that grow that you can use to make extracts that will help other plants. And, using tomatoes or tobacco as an extract to, if you've got aphids, that sort of thing. It's very, very interesting. And there's so much experimentation you can do, so just getting fascination about plants and what they can offer us is key, and that's our non-judgmental allies is how I characterize plants.
And indicator, but yeah, there are these terms we need to be using, and I think that like if people did get the bug to really understand like what does that plant tell you, like there's guides out there that basically tell you what this plant is, what it does, what is it cycling chemistry wise, and then based on that information, then you can decide, oh, this plant would go really well based on succession as a fertilizer or a plant ferment fertilizer for these other plants. And now again, you're improving the soil, you're improving the environment, you're working with nature, not fighting it. And the benefits are clear when you do this. And that was one of the other things that when I first got into trying to stabilize fish manure. Now, don't get me wrong, fish shit stinks. It's smelly, right? And in the early days when I was starting to work at some of these farms, overworked, underpaid employees, shit doesn't get cleaned up. These biofilters were just the nastiest things that you could possibly imagine. Like I literally, if I got some of that black on me, I had to throw my clothes away. Even though I scrubbed myself for 3 days, I could still smell it. So I was not very attractive to my girlfriends when I started playing with this stuff. But I learned that it's a matter of like finding a way to get rid of the anaerobic pocket and create an aerobic one. And now this stuff, I could stabilize it in, a matter of an hour versus like 2 weeks to try to stabilize it. So yeah, but even still, after 2 weeks of bubbling, I take that stuff and I put it on plants, and the plants would explode. So I don't care how nasty, stinking the stuff is. There are ways to aerobically stabilize it and bring it back and make it something that doesn't smell bad, that actually has huge benefits to the soil, both the indigenous biology as well as the ones you sussed out of it. So
I want to follow up on the thread there about indigenous biology, and when it kind of comes back to what I was talking about originally about the stone circles. When in Scotland they have Neolithic Man, right, who is 5,500 years ago. Here in Southern California, chumash culture at least went back 13,000 years. 13,000 years. I mean, this is time immemorial. We can't even really conceive of the amount of time. And there was so much knowledge in the local indigenous people about plants and what the uses of plants were, medicinal plants, and that knowledge we pretty much lost. But we're beginning. My friend Lanny Coffer wrote a book about the medicinal plants of Southern California. We're beginning to claw a bit of that back. So there's respect for indigenous knowledge of plants that we need, and we need to revere it and really to spend more time looking at our indigenous plants. And so the landscape that we have, there's so much out there, and it's amazing. I mean, the oak trees, for a start, they were the staple, the food staple, right? The Chumash ate the acorns, and that was their staple. And like wheat for us or rice for other folks. And we don't eat very much of that now. In fact, when I buy acorn flour, it's imported from Korea.
I know, right? It's crazy. It's crazy.
So yeah, it is interesting. There's a lot we can do, and there's a lot to learn. But I think the term indigenous is one to pay attention to. And it is interesting here that in Southern California, there are indigenous people, and there are certainly indigenous plants and habitats. It's a little bit different over in Scotland. It's a little harder to connect to indigenous habitat over there. But here it really is a treat that we got so much wildland that we've got stuff going on. So yeah. I think that a curiosity about plants and engendering that in the next generation, that's a challenge, and that's an opportunity too.
So I'm so blessed. The universe always shines on me for some reason. Have you heard about Rocketdyne?
Like, are you talking Santa Susana Lab?
Yep. So have you ever been up there?
I have not, but it's kind of a splash in the news right now because that was a place where they were doing did nuclear reactors fail there in the 50s?
Yeah, they had the first ever nuclear reactor power. Now, this all started with Operation Paperclip, when we grabbed all the Nazi scientists and brought them back to America and funded them to continue their research. That was one of the hotbeds up there. Boeing, NASA, this company Rocketdyne, we're all up there doing all kinds of crazy badass shit. Now, the interesting thing was they chose that mountain top because of the military position or defenses. Was basically 2 roads up there, and one of them was so small it's a cart path, and the other one they improved so that they could bring all the trucks and equipment and up and down, etc. Well, I was up there because of the bridge project and another guy who's trying to do the oak restoration up there, because that's where the Woolsey fire started. And they lost an incredible grove up there. So he actually sued, I think it was Boeing, because they were the waste was leaching from one of the burn pits down into the river that was basically going past a Boy Scout and a Girl Scout camp.
Oh my God.
And so he sued them and he won. And he won a large settlement. And then they asked him to come up and start working with them in reforesting the area, which was an amazing turnaround. So because of my work, he invited me to go up there to talk about what he was trying to do and how I could improve or make compost up on the site for them to use as the pots or the plants got bigger and bigger. And so he's walking me around the site and my hair's standing up on the back of my neck. And I'm like, getting this, like, well, I'm an empath, so I feel energy, right? So the further we went down the trail, the more my hair was standing up, to the point where I showed him, I'm like, look it, dude, is this like an indigenous religious place or something?
Yes.
And he laughed and he said, how did you know? I go, I'm an empath, dude. Like, I can feel it. And he brought me over to this place where he showed me all these cupping rocks. You know what those are?
Mm-hmm.
And then he points to this protrusion of a rock sticking off of a cliff. And he says, during the winter solstice, the sun gets behind that, and that arrow points to this cave. And he goes, you see the cave over there? And I'm like, yeah, I can. So can we go closer? We got as close as we could because they have a barbed wire fence around it. And there's all these cave paintings in there. And he, at one point, was allowed to go inside of this, Chumash ceremonial site. And he got some pictures, which he did show me. But it was like, oh my God, the energy was insane. And what he basically explained to me was that every winter solstice, 3 different tribes got together at this sacred space to hold celebration of the the harvest or the changing of the year or the time. And so that it had been, they carbon dated it, like you said, some crazy number, 13,000 years ago. And so I was working on the bridge project as well. And one of the girls, the nursery workers, turns out was Chumash. And she was like, pulled me aside one day and said, Leighton, all this work that you're doing is amazing. Will it help restore some of our degraded soils? And I went on to tell her, I go, look, I've done projects to clean up toxic waste. I actually pitched the Rocketdyne people about letting me come up there and do some bioremediation on small scale so I could show them what I can do, because they're talking about harvesting 100 million yards of soil off that mountain, trucking it to Nevada, burning it, and then hauling back other soil. I mean, that's an environmental disaster in its own, let alone the billions of dollars that would cost, where I can do it in situ. So I made a little pitch to the woman that was kind of running the operation up there. And she got all excited and was like, yeah, this we could definitely do a small plot. And then all of a sudden, Boeing started suing NASA. NASA started suing Boeing. Both of them started suing California. California started suing them. And she bailed. She blew out of there. And that was about 1.5 years ago. Well, somebody went to, whether it was the state or one of these organizations, NASA or Boeing, said, hey, look, we can't just sue each other for the next 50 years. This has to be dealt with. Like, you were supposed to have this cleanup underway years ago.
Right.
So enough is enough. Here's a negotiator or mediator. You guys are all going to have to work together to come up with an answer for dealing with this. And you got 2 years to do it. So I'm in the process of working with her as she moves up the elder ladder to get the whole indigenous group together with them to say, hey, look, we have solutions to dealing with this. We have muncher juice. We have compost extracts that have shown to break down hydrocarbons, atrazines, all kinds of things. And so hopefully we do get a foot in the door, because we could literally save everybody billions of dollars by doing it this way.
I've got a couple of friends who are putting quite a bit of work into the Santa Susana, exposing that. And so one of them is Kit Stoltz, and he's an environmental journalist. And actually the Ojai Valley News has been covering this story, which really he's, I think, going to get support from Reuters to do some, it's a national story. The fact that they covered up nuclear reactor meltdown, and there's reactors exploding and distributing uncontained nuclear reaction all over Simi Valley, and that's why there's cancer rates are high around there. It's not a place you want to be, especially when it's burning. And then it is interesting, it's a special site for the Chumash. So it's a sordid story. And so Larry Yee, who was on the Regional Water Quality Control Board for LA, he was very involved in that and basically got canned from that because he was involved in it. And then Kit Stoltz, he's doing a bunch of journalism about it. So actually, Leighton, I'll probably connect you with Kit. Just he's a long-standing friend of mine. I've known him for over 30 years, and really a fantastic gentleman.
So I'm hoping I'm going to reach back out to John, who was the one.
I'd like to talk. He'll be interested to talk to you about it. It's more and more people need to know about Rocketdyne, which is now called Santa Susana Field Lab, and what went down there. And it really seems like a lot was covered up. And then what's happening now is that I think it's the county is suing the state because the state hasn't enforced the cleanup that is supposed to have happened. But the cleanup, how do you clean that stuff up where they were just, I mean, the knowledge about how to deal with these wastes in the 1950s just was like, you put it over there. And they would actually put waste into drums and then blow it up, fire artillery at it. That was their way of dealing with toxic waste.
Dude, even worse than that, they had a burn pit.
I know.
They were openly burning mercury.
Oh my God! Yeah.
And at one point, there was 3 scientists that actually blew themselves up in the burn pit because they were inappropriately handling these freaking high energy explosives and rocket fuels and everything else. And somebody dropped something or did something wrong, and the 3 of them got incinerated. They just blew into smithereens. And the problem is that it's not that they blew themselves up. It's they blew up the burn pit. So all of that went up into the fucking atmosphere. It's like, what the fuck?
You don't want to live near Simi Valley, basically, especially if it's burning.
But
so that is it's a big story. And, Boeing is, it involves military industrial complex, and it's a big deal, and it's horrible. I mean, really, to have nuclear reactor failures with no containment and then cover it up. The stories I'm getting out of there it's hellacious. I mean, what a thing. Anyway, but in Merlin Sheldrake's book, he actually says that there are fungi that can use radioactivity as their energy source that will grow towards radioactivity. So again, it's like, oh wow, fungi are super flexible, and that gives me hope. It's like, okay, there are ways that we can deal with this, and it seems like the fungal queendom, as I like to refer to it as, really could be the answer for a lot of our messes.
Did you hear about Elaine's work at Chernobyl?
No.
Oh yeah, Elaine worked with the government, the local government there after that disaster calmed down, and she basically demonstrated that Microrizy will pull the isotopes out of the soil and bring it to the plant, and the plant will say, "I don't want that," and the Microrizy goes and builds a whole new hyphae and just starts stacking up those isotopes because they're often mixed in with the other. When they're using their organic acids, they're extracting them accidentally. So basically the radioactivity came way down until just recently when the Russians invaded Ukraine. They drove a tank division through there and tripped every single nuclear alarm that was on that facility. And the poor bastards dug in and they didn't even know what they were doing. All they knew was the alarms were blasted and, the communications was obviously nil because of they were invading. I mean, that whole invasion was a disaster. And finally they realized what was going on and they pulled all the troops out of there. But prior to that, there have been biologists studying the radioactive effect, the isotopes effect on different types of coyote and the wildlife, which has exploded in that area.
Yeah, there's a lot of wildlife
since we left. So we know how to tie it up. Whether we can metabolize or shorten the half-life, which is, I think, what your gentleman was referring to, is the ability to reduce the half-life, makes it less and less toxic. I mean, radon, which is a big scare back east, radon gas, which is another bullshit because it's a sister. It's not even an isotope. It's a sister of a sister of a sister of radioactivity. It's harmless for the most part. I mean, yeah, there are some pockets that are a little bit more problematic, but for the most part, radon gas was like lead paint. It's like
you don't want to be breathing. It's the second leading cause of lung cancer is radon. You don't want to be.
Yeah, but that's real radon. That's not the fucking general. For the most part, radon gas comes from fissures that go deep into the earth, right? Mm. So not all times when they detect it is it that dangerous. It could be, again, a sister of a sister of a sister where it's not going to hurt you. And to be honest with you, the real killer for lung cancer is silica. If you drive on a dirt road, you're breathing in what's called P2.5. It's a particulate. Right. It's so small that it'll get in your capillary. And if it gets in your capillary, it gets infected. And that's the cause of tuberculosis. So, again, like there are outliers of specific, like in the Granite State, there's some pockets of radon that are pretty hardcore. But for the most part, it's just a blown out of proportion scare tactic to get people to buy these radon mitigation kits for their basements. I mean, that was a big booming business back in the day, back in the 90s in my area. And most of it was proven to be bullshit. But again, I didn't mean to get on a rant about that. I think the
radon rant.
Yeah, I think the important fact is we have already identified bacteria and fungi that can break down anything, even PFAS. Some of it's been done in the lab. A lot of it's been done in the field. But the biggest problem is the military-industrial complex, who funds the environmental engineer firms, don't want to do this because they're going to lose billions of taxpayers' money. So that's the biggest problem we have, unless, like in Rocketdyne case, where a mediator came in and said, all right, you're not going to be allowed to just kick this can down the road. You guys got to deal with it. And they're actively taking proposals, I believe now or soon, for people to come and say, hey, look, I can do this or I can do that. And I'm hoping that I can get the opportunity to do a small scale demonstration.
Yeah, well, I'm curious about that. And as I say, I'll connect you with Kit Stoltz. That's been one of the unintended good consequences of this conversation, is that we make connections. It's all about connections, right?
Listen to this. They have these giant pumps and filters. And what they're doing is they're creating a vacuum underground to rip all the groundwater out and then run it through these filters before they reintroduce it to try to start screening some of this shit off. It's helping. It's not solving the problem. And to be honest with you, it's never going to get into every crack and crevice. But with the use of those machines, irrigation that you see out here in the strawberry fields, those just giant pipes with the top spinners, you could put a compost extract into those, do acres and acres at a time, take one of those vacuum sucker trucks and reverse it. Now you're sucking or blowing the friggin' compost tea in, so you're not exploding the microbes. You're pushing it in with a diaphragm. You just spray all that on the surface, and with that pump that's creating a vacuum underground, dude, perfect delivery system.
Interesting.
Perfect delivery system. And that shit will get into the cracks and crevices to clean up everything forever. So the technology's there. They just don't have the people with the friggin' lunatic ideas to do it.
Well, I'm stoked to hear that Elaine was working over in Chernobyl. What do you hear about? Have you talked to Elaine or been in connection with her anytime recently? I see the whole soil food web thing is that there's like this. There's people who are pushing her education program. Is what I see. Yeah.
So that's something that I'd prefer to talk off air for right now. There's some undercurrents that are going on, but again,
she's not a business person. She wants everybody to know about Soil Food Web, and that's why I love her. And the kind of cashing in on her knowledge and making it into a business is it's always going to be problematic, isn't it?
Agreed. And I've been a close friend of hers since Rodale, and I've watched this repeat itself again and again. But normally at the hour and a half point, I'd stop and we answer some questions, and we just got chopping it up, and I lost track of time. So there are two questions for you.
Okay.
So Ken, why don't you go ahead and fire up the questions? And interestingly enough, this often leads to further conversation. So
I don't know how that would happen. A simple question,
And David, you were worried about being on for this time. Look where we are.
I know. Well, it's just about the other stuff I've got to do, but it worked out fine. But I won't tell you what I was up to before and what I've got to do afterwards, but I'm happy to be here. But what's the questions?
We got Casper Johnson wants for the doc updates on strawberry breeding project.
Don't know about the strawberry breeding project, but I actually had a friend who was just planting strawberries, and I advised them. I looked up some research that was done on Microrizy and strawberries, and I gave him a generalist mix of Microrizy to dip his bare root strawberries in before he planted them. So strawberries are the biggest commercial crop in Ventura County, and they use a lot of plastic. It's incredible. They cover the land in plastic. They form it into beds. They put plastic on it, and they punch holes in it, and then they treat it as an annual here for commercial strawberry crop. And if you're buying strawberries, only buy organic strawberries. Don't buy non-organic strawberries because it's super toxic for the people who are working with them. But there's, even for the organic strawberries, ton of plastic. And that is just was talking to somebody who works at the local landfill, and he said the biggest thing that they get continually in there is the ag field plastic. So I would say, cautious with your strawberries, but I don't know much about the strawberry experiment. I'm not sure what that's referring to. Sorry.
I think it might have been the experiment I did a couple years ago with Harry's Berries, where we created a matrix of gypsum, Portland, cocoa coarse, and pit moss, and we made a paper mache. And we laid it over instead of the plastic. And I actually did the first experiment. The first iteration was in my garden for 2 years, and was still fully functional. So I think that's probably maybe what that was about. Unfortunately, I couldn't convince the powers that be, because we've been doing it this way for 30 years. We don't need to change. That if they did use this, we could get rid of 4 billion cubic feet of plastic a year just in like a 10-mile zone from where I live. That is just staggering. And it's like the piece of equipment to make it would probably cost about $125,000 to lay down the paper mache. Cheap, so super cheap. And they could literally, when they switch out, because they switch out the strawberries twice a year, they could just have a crew go in and just smooth over the old holes and punch the new ones, offset the other ones. And this is aerobic, because that's the other big problem. They're in anaerobic environments, and they all have crown rot. They have all these other fungal problems that they got to go and fumigate. Like they fumigated like the whole area down here this summer.
Yeah.
Like I couldn't breathe for like 3 days. I had shortness of breath after they fumigated around. It's fucking horrible. Yeah, you're right. Don't buy the non-organic strawberries, because you're killing me and the workers.
Yep. And just to point out, guys, you were talking about the mycelium. They're actually using it to make furniture now. They're growing it out, pressing it with heat, which stops the biological reactions, and you have perfect furniture.
And
it's amazing. I'm excited about the potential of fungi and what they can get up to. Yep, it's super cool.
So our other question again was from Casper. For tea recipes, what are you using for tea recipes?
Oh, first, let me give him a plug. I mean, I've looked at compost extracts and teas all over the country for 15-something years. You were the first guy. Remember when we were in the box truck and you brought your sample and you asked me to look at it, and I was like, damn, dude, that's the best tea I've ever seen.
Oh, okay. Well, I think that there's a lot, and it is about the quality of the compost. So the inputs to your compost are key. And so that's why I stress native inputs, right, for your carbon source. And I pretty much use Coast Live Oak where I can. So that's brings in a bunch of biology. And I mean, when I'm doing composting at schools, I'll have them bring in straw bales just because it's convenient and it's easy. You can bring in a bunch of carbon and it's in a functional item. But you don't know that it probably is not growing organically, and there could be residues on it, and it could be issues there. In terms of foods, Leighton and I have both been working with a local seafood company, which is making its own fish hydrolysate. And fish hydrolysate is a fungal food. And it's pretty nice that these guys are doing it with fish that they're it's called Get Hooked Seafood. And they have a delivery service actually. And they say that the Channel Islands, where the Santa Barbara Channel, where we live adjacent to, is one of the most productive areas of fishing in the world, and they say it's a sustainable fishery and all of that, because we do have marine protected areas there. So I use fish hydrolysate, and I'm primarily making my compost teas for perennials, and then I use liquid kelp, and I put in shout out also to Island Seed and Feed in Goleta. They have landscape mix, which is all meals. It's fish feather, kelp, soy, and alfalfa. And I put some of that in too. And then always I use humate. I always put humate in, humic acid. And that's primarily because I'm using water from the water district that's been treated with chloramines. And Elaine told me that humate will complex the chloramines. So I'll put in just enough to give a bit of color to the water. I mean, we're talking like a quarter cup in 35 gallons or something like that. I mean, and that's the amounts that I'm putting in of liquid kelp or liquid fish. And those are pretty much the only foods that I use. And there's certainly a move. I would say that there's people who don't use any foods. They're just making extracts. Compost extracts, and that's what I think Biggest Local Farm is doing now. they moved away from making compost teas. And I think that's partly because their land has recovered so much from it being industrial citrus, where they've done all the cover cropping and they've got some really nice soils now. And they now have a spreader which will make kind of like a, it's a compost extract, I guess. And it just sprays that on the landscape, and they don't use any foods at all. So, but yeah, I do use fishing kelp is the main one I use. Leighton, to that, what foods are you bunging in any foods?
I got pure extract. Because I don't want to have to be with a gun against my head to have it use it within 30 hours. So basically, I make an extract, and at time of application, I'll add kelp, I'll add molasses. Depending on the job, sometimes Microrizy powder, sometimes some liquid calcium. You know, if my boron levels are right, my calcium is low, then I'll add a little calcium. So it really depends, but basically no foods, pure extracts, and add the foods right at the time.
And I think that it's a good point, because we're producing a product that's not shelf stable. And so, I mean, all the people that I'm dealing with, they use it immediately. It's not something that I'm putting in a bottle and putting on a shelf. It's used immediately. And yeah, I've done quite a bit of research over the years, looking at how much food I can add and how long I can brew for, and then what happens. And you can usually just tell with your nose, right? And you know, how long can your brewer run with, and you know, how much compost can you put in? But feeding at the end, you know, just as Leighton says, before you apply it, that's going to have less issue than if you're putting foods into your brewer.
Yeah, Leighton, how long do you brew it after you've put the food in? Would be a good question for people.
So I would usually wait about 5 minutes just to make sure that it was equally distributed. Now, again, I use a cone bottom tank, 125 gallon. So because the air is coming up through the center column, it's creating this vortex that's constantly, you know, everything is being blended together very quickly. And, you know, one of the ways I can tell that is, like, I'll have just water in there. I'll squirt in some molasses, and you can just see it goes poof into suspension throughout the whole thing. So I know I'm getting really good agitation. Now, if you have a flat bottom tank, it's a little harder to get things to not fall out of suspension, especially in the rim around the outside. So that's why, again, I'm a big fan of cone bottoms. You'll never have an issue with them.
It's funny because I've got 3 different cone tanks depending on how much I'm brewing, and the air goes in the bottom, and it's it's a pretty nice system. And then I have a mesh basket on the top instead of using a bag, and that's been really cool too. I get a little bit of sediment residue, but not much, and then I strain it through a 400 micron bag when I deliver it, so it avoids the equipment getting blocked up. But it doesn't really matter for the guys who are just doing it in 5-gallon buckets. Sometimes the landscapers, I'm just delivering it in 5-gallon buckets, and they're using it as a soil drench. But the arborists are using it, injecting it, and also doing foliar. And so they don't want to have it block up their nozzles or whatever. So
no, I with them, I mean, I have the injector, and even my tree injector, I ported the holes out.
Make them fatter.
Sediment issues, but when I use my foliar gun, forget it. It's just like instantly clogged. So I hear it.
Yeah, you got a civet. Right on. Well, look, we're at 4. We made it for 2 hours
without trying. Okay, there's so much more I wanted to suss out of you. I mean, there's more about the stones, more about, you know, this deeper understanding of the connection of the whole, the one, the soil, the kids. The Shumash, oh man, we could have gone on for another 2 hours. So
everything's connected.
It is. So I'll bug you in the future to come back on, because I think we've just begun the conversation. I think there's a lot more that we can again suss out, you know, about our experiences and about, you know, helping the people that are listening. And again, this is recorded, so typically Ken gets a tremendous amount of traffic after the fact as well.
Yeah.
Right on. Well, thanks, Ken, for hosting. Thanks, Leighton, for being my buddy.
Absolutely, buddy.
We'll
Absolutely.
stick around after David, and we'll talk, because you need to mix numbers and that. But guys, as for the channel, we've got Wednesday, and then I've got Jerry Butler from Butler Family Farms on Friday, talking about homesteading, etc. But David, I want to say thank you very much. And Leighton, give us that date again for Peach Hill for when you're doing.
So there's a couple things. We have the Heirloom Seed Fest at the Ventura County Fairgrounds from 10th, 11th, and 12th. We actually, and you don't even know this yet, David. Eric got us this whole little corner. We got a stage, we got a sound system. I'm pulling up the box truck. He's hanging a plasma on it.
All right. Okay.
We're going to show microbes. Hopefully I could borrow your camera, because he wants to beam the microbes on the outside, and then do tours of it, so people get an understanding of what is dissolved organic matter, how best to use it, which is basically a compost extract, same thing, a compost tea. So that just blew up. Yeah, that just blew up. And then the second date is Peach Hill Soils, November 2nd. We're going to do an open house with 5 different workshops. And again, I'm hoping that you'll join me, Michael, and Brian up top where I work. And we're going to just do, 4 little tents and quick little workshops for people that come up there. And then they're going to get toured around on those little Jurassic Park friggin' golf cart.
Okay.
So, and then there'll be lunch. Yeah, there'll be lunch, and then kids' corner for the kids to plant seeds. And so it'll be a great time for sure.
Right on. Cool.
Okay, and JP, reach out to me at it'sallaboutthebiology.com or at gmail.com, and I'll help answer that question on the Rhizosphere. Anyway, guys, we're going to cut it there, and we'll see you guys on Wednesday.